Welcome to Hidden Layers, where we explore the people and the tech behind artificial intelligence. I'm your host, Ron Green, and I'm happy to be joined today by my colleague, Alex Olden, to discuss the multifaceted world of data science, and specifically how it intersects with the concept of product sense within AI. Today, we're diving deep into the realms of opportunity identification, product evaluation, and how to truly align AI development with user needs. Alex is a senior data scientist at Kung Fu AI, where he embraces the catch-all nature of the discipline. He's equally interested in exploratory data analysis and statistical modeling, and he's just as passionate about causal inference as he is about data visualization. Above all, though, Alex thrives in projects that hinge on collaboration and communication. Alex holds a BA in English and an MS in Applied Statistics from Villanova University. Outside of work, Alex enjoys writing, cycling, and relearning how to play the piano. Welcome, Alex. Thanks for joining us.
Sure. It's great to be here.
So you wrote a blog post recently where you tied together your experiences teaching with your experiences in data science, and you use a great analogy to kind of tee up the concept of product sense.
Sure.
Can you take us through that analogy and then define product sense to tee up the rest of the conversation?
Yeah, for sure. I think the analogy that I used was talking about the short version of it is anticipating the needs of a student. So if I see a student walk into class, he starts writing something down, his pencil breaks. Instead of waiting for him to raise his hand and kind of disrupt the flow of the start of class, I run over, grab an extra pencil, put it on his desk. No words or communication necessary, problem solved, we're back in business. So in the same way that I was anticipating the need of a student there and solving the problem as quickly as I could, in terms of developing AI, I think it's really helpful to try to anticipate the needs of customers. In our case, that can be our client that we're working with or our client's customers, their users, if you will. And so that can play out in a few different ways. One could be opportunity identification. It can be looking at a set of data and saying, hey, we've got this data. That means we could build this product for this user base. But I think another way of thinking about it too is looking at existing products or services. I want to be clear that when we talk about product sense, that can be actual products or services as well.
Okay.
But more thinking through, here's an existing product or service. How well does it work? Let's kick the tires on it. Is it performing well? Is demand for it high and healthy? If it's a service, are people renewing it? Things like that to have a good sense of, what our clients or their customers need and want and are kind of responding to. But this can also be data-driven. We can go into exploratory data analysis and kind of see how are these products performing? Are people using them? Are they re-upping subscriptions? Things like that. But a lot of it is also can be just instinct and experience-based too. So I don't want to say it's all data-driven. A lot of it is getting a feel for it as well, I think.
In your blog post, you mentioned the importance of identifying opportunities with using product sense. How do you go about approaching and identifying new opportunities with your clients?
Yeah, so there's a few things to keep in mind. One is always thinking about the user. I heard a product expert speak once a while back, and they said, if you're designing a basketball and you think about the basketball, you've already taken a bad first step. Because you want to think about the user, the basketball player, and think about what their experience is going to be like. And so you can kind of take that analogy as far as you want, but I think that gets the point across for now. Another thing that I'll say is it's really important to avoid products in search of solutions. Sometimes when a new technology comes out or you're playing around and you learn about this new algorithm, you're like, oh, this is so cool. I need to go find a way to use it. And it's like, it could almost fit sometimes. But if it doesn't really fit and it doesn't ultimately serve the end user and their experience in a beneficial way, you got to just hit pause and wait for another opportunity to use it.
Right, right. That idea of having a solution in search of a problem.
Absolutely. And the last thing that I'll say is that follow the data too. If you, let's say, run like an online kitchen supply store and you see a lot of customers manually adding like a food processor to their cart and then manually adding like a peeler, presumably to peel the food before it goes in the processor, like that's a good sign that those products should be bundled. And if you see customers buying or putting a food processor in their cart, you should recommend throwing a peeler in there too. And that's where the data can really influence product development as well.
Okay. How do you approach the problem of sort of evaluating product opportunities on your project, like and assessing them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question because it can be a little bit kind of nebulous and trying to predict the future a little bit.
Absolutely.
But I think it's important to again, look at any existing data that you have to see if there is a demand for a product or if there are similar products that are being used that are maybe doing well, but not quite fitting all of a user need. If there's like additional opportunity that could be added by adding another offering or things like that.
Okay.
From our end at Kung Fu, of course, we spend a ton of time doing subject matter expert or SME interviews. And that's a really good way to get to know our clients and their needs and the needs of their customers. So that can fill in a lot of that. And then, communication along the way, like we usually have like a regular weekly meeting to give an update on here's what we've done, here's where we're going, and get feedback from our clients right away. And having a lot of asynchronous communication too, just like, hey, like we put together a model, here are the results, like let us know what you think when you have a minute.
Right.
So just constant communication, but not over communication.
Right.
We always like to defer to the client to get a sense of, what pace do you want? Another thing that's important too is to just from the beginning, after those SME interviews and the project plan is laid out, get a sense of like, kind of this like holy grail document of here's the goal, everything that we do should be rowing in that direction, and anything that is not, we need to reconsider. And that way everyone stays on the same page. And it also really puts a lot of power, I think anyway, in the seat of the client because it makes the project client driven and Kung Fu guided rather than the other way around. Because we want to facilitate, we want to enable. Obviously, we're doing some work for them, but we don't want to be straight up telling them what to do too much because they know their users better than we do for sure.
Right.
So that's a key part of it as well.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And a huge part of it, I always feel, is the fact that we're almost invariably working in a really, complicated domain that our clients understand at a level that, we'll never get to.
That's a great point.
And so making sure that we walk in with an open mind, let them be the domain experts and drive the initiative from sort of a return on investment perspective and not just leverage technology for technology's sake.
Absolutely.
So what about the statement that, AI development should start with the end user in mind? How do you make sure that during this process that's actually done?
Yeah, a lot of it has to do with what I touched on in the previous question about, from the beginning with the end in mind, in this case, the end being the user, and having everything that you do kind of flow from there and point in that direction and documenting that stuff early on.
Okay.
And then when it comes time to kind of get into the work, from the beginning of the process, which is at least like the technical work, I should clarify, doing your exploratory data analysis, you want to get in and look and see, is the work that I'm doing to get more information about this company, this client, this customer, what have you, in the data, is that kind of in the direction of this goal that we've previously established? If not, you need to recalibrate again. And then from there, just checking in, keeping the customer or the client updated along the way to make sure that they are seeing what we're seeing and understanding it and agreeing that it's useful. And just always keeping that focus on the end customer, user, what have you. And that's just from the beginning. And, there's a whole process, of course, to AI development that comes after exploratory analysis. There's testing, there's development, there's prototyping, there's experimentation, checking the validation metrics at the end, all that stuff. Along each one of those steps, it's got to be coming back to like, how does this benefit the user? Like, where are they going to fit into this?
Yeah.
And making sure that really does serve them.
Yeah. I see this quite frequently where maybe you can be halfway through the journey on a product or a feature development cycle, and you can kind of lose sight of what the initial impetus was, right?
For sure.
And what the user will receive or get out of this. And you can lose your way, even though you may have had a firm initial foundation. So when you're approaching sort of the early stages of data exploration, how do you tie the analysis back to the user to make sure whatever AI tool or capability you developed does serve that end user?
Yeah. So just to dig a little deeper on the EDA part of things, I mentioned previously talking about kind of like EDA in the direction of a certain thing. Like that's the first point. So, I do a lot of EDA as a data scientist, of course. When I dig in, there can be tons of data. And a good way to kind of cull it and focus a little bit is to think about which pieces of data or which data sources are going to be associated to this previously agreed upon goal, which is whatever the user is going to be using the product or service for. And so that can kind of winnow it down. And not to say like we're just like disregarding important data, but that's how you make decisions about what to really dig into. And then from there, of course, you're going to look for, correlations between different features, null rates, what's clean, what's dirty, what can be used, what might need a little bit of touching up. But really looking for kind of an early descriptive statistics that will start to answer questions about either user experiences or user preferences early on. So if you see, to go back to what I mentioned previously about this hypothetical like online kitchen supply store, if you see users buying certain types of products together, like that can be a key insight into user behavior that may serve in the long run. But it's really just making really intentional decisions about which data you dig into and prepare and organize that are going to drive everything downstream. Again, algorithm selection, development, testing, just in the direction of answering that kind of North Star user use case in the end.
Okay. Have you ever developed a solution, and then once you were done with it, you realized you really didn't have a customer need? You kind of missed the mark?
It's tempting sometimes to. I will say I've not fully gone down that road because I've kind of checked myself before I've wrecked myself. But it's really tempting sometimes when like a new technology comes out to be like, oh, this is super cool. I got to find a way to use this.
Right.
Like I can't not use this. So there's that temptation. And I think that can flow in from like the development side that we're on at Kung Fu, but also probably for some customers and users too, of like ChatGPT is super hot right now. And so it's really tempting to be like, oh, if I'm not using ChatGPT, like I'm doing something wrong. But like to clarify, like in the world of AI, ChatGPT is not AI.
Right.
Like a calculator is AI. And so you can start there and you go to ChatGPT in the end. And then in the middle, you've got like your bread and butter, like decision trees, your logistic regressions. They're great at solving like predictive problems too.
Right.
But using the right tool for the right job is super essential. And that's a good way to kind of keep things in check, because otherwise, we can waste a lot of our time as developers of AI doing things that aren't useful for our clients. But on the client side, to give like a little bit of advice there, it's really important to kind of see the long term and be intentional about adopting whatever AI tools you adopt. Because if you put time, money, resources into adopting ChatGPT and it's not useful, like 1, 2, 3 years later, you're not going to have a useful product for your customers because they can't use it. And so you want to be more careful and maybe adopting something that's a little bit less flashy, but gets the job done, because that's going to serve your customers. And 1, 2 years, 3 years down the road, you're going to be getting a return on your investment. You're going to be in a really successful place. And I think about this a little bit of like, meme stocks versus like index funds. Like it's slow, steady, long-term growth,
Right.
doing the right thing in the long run, versus like throwing a lot of money at something that is maybe going to be totally devalued in 3 months. And not that ChatGPT will be devalued, but it's more on, getting what you can and getting the best out of your monetary and otherwise investment in these AI tools.
Right.
Playing the long game.
Okay, so I couldn't agree more with that. Don't just gravitate and jump on the bandwagon for whatever the current hotness is. So this segues perfectly into my next question, which is when you're working with your stakeholders and you're building relationships, that can kind of be a critical component to being able to have frank conversations around what may be applicable or not. So, for example, how do you manage the relationship so that you could tell your client, I think, ChatGPT integration, that might not be the right move at this point. We might need to do something else, even though they internally may be getting pressure to leverage some new hot technology.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, I'd say what I just said in the last question, of course, but I think keeping in mind the idea that like, data-driven or intuition-driven, whatever driver there is of this idea of product sense that I'm going after here, it is not designed to be kind of a source of tension and, adversity with a client. Like that may happen, but ideally it's a collaborative effort. Mm-hmm. So ideally these are the same things of like, we're going to develop the product to do Surface X for your users that we've agreed upon early on. We're giving you these regular updates. We're having the regular meetings. And so it's really a collaborative effort. And again, to what I said previously, like we want it to be Kung Fu guided and customer driven, mm-hmm. not the other way around. And so by us taking the time to really dig into their data, talk to their subject matter experts, get a sense of what's important to you, ideally, we're kind of showing our investment in you and understanding you as a client so that it's clear, we're rowing in the same direction here. Like I said, it's a collaborative effort to get to the end goal of serving your users.
Right. We're
not coming in and saying, use this thing. And like, that's the end of it. And if a client feels kind of pressured to use something else that we don't recommend, I want to continue the conversation, but also try to make it a little bit evidence-based and like going in and saying, here's what we saw in exploratory data analysis, which is why EDA is so powerful. Like, here's what your users are doing. Here's why this would benefit them. And then, we can dig in deeper from there.
Okay. That makes a ton of sense. And so that any advice on sort of stakeholder relationship management as a part of this flow, this process of tying, sort of raw data and metrics to what can be sometimes a soft human decision on what to actually focus on?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one way to do it is to really show that you've listened to them.
Mm-hmm.
So through your subject matter expert interviews, through everything that you learned about their company, include that in what you're saying back to them, so that it shows, we're not just taking this like one size fits all information that we throw at every client we come across, but more thinking through, here's what you've told us. Here's how we've organized it and distilled it into like a clear set of steps that we think can really benefit you and your users, whether they be internal employees, outside users, whatever the case may be. But that just shows that we're listening, we're paying attention, we're doing these really customized solutions to your problems.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's been a really good way for us to develop kind of client, trust and investment in the same way that like in my teaching days, like that's how I showed students that I was paying attention. Like I knew their homework habits, I knew what they needed. There's this phrase that I heard when I first started teaching of like, students don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And like, that's a great way to show that you care. It's that you're paying attention, you're listening, you're writing down, you're anticipating their needs, to go back to the idea of product sense in the first place.
Oh, that's a great quote. I've never heard that that teacher quote.
Yeah.
How do you deal with instances where you get customer feedback or client feedback and it actually changes your direction? Like, have you been involved in a project where you had to pivot or change direction sort of mid-development?
Yeah, it's a great question too. We were working with a client once who had a project focused around resource allocation and trying to optimize and get the most out of the resources they were devoting to different tasks. And we built a model that kind of predicted, hey, if you make changes X, Y, and Z, you'll see this improvement or estimated improvement in your return on investment for those resources. And this was just a prototype model. It wasn't, going to be deployed or anything like that, but more just a proof of concept to show like, yeah, we can do this. And we sent that back to them and they liked it, but they wanted to get a little bit more granular on their ROI and say like, at which levels of this resource allocation, like, level A is like they're using it a ton, level B is kind of moderate usage, and level C, let's say, is like really kind of low usage. Like,
okay,
is it going to be only like the highest burning category of this resource that gets the ROI, and like B and C are just like hanging out? And which is a great question. And so we had to go like back to the mental lab and kind of think through how to do that. And so we landed on an approach that kind of broke out the ROI by allocation level A, B, and C to show, here's the projected level of return on investment for levels A, B, and C, and showed that there will be, an improvement for all three levels.
For all three categories.
Exactly. And it's not just going to be like level B pulling A and C up with it or something like that. So it was a really interesting question. And I'm glad the client asked it, because it's the sort of thing we're probably using again for this type of kind of projection.
Okay. Does that happen frequently where you'll have questions asked by the client that kind of drives more of the discovery process in a direction maybe you didn't anticipate?
Yeah, I think so. It's maybe 50-50 off the top of my head. And some clients are happy to sit back and kind of take our advice. Others like to be more active. And I think there's pros and cons to each. We always like an active client in the same way that you like an active student who's asking questions and driving the discussion. But in some cases, you start with the client and you just click with them and you're on the same page from the beginning. And like, it moves faster. And that's not better or worse. It's just a different model for collaboration.
Right.
But we always learn new things from clients when they kind of poke and prod at stuff too. Yeah. So it's a lot of fun that way.
Yeah. Okay. Earlier on, you were talking about product evaluation. Are there any specific metrics that you'll use commonly as a part of that process when you're trying to assess the value or the viability of some specific approach or solution?
For sure. Kind of two buckets of metrics. One, I would say, is around if you have any of them, because if it's a new product, you may not necessarily have these, but kind of what the marketplace is saying about it. What are sales like? What is demand like? If it's a subscription service, are people renewing the subscription and continuing to use it? Things like that can be a good sign. But there's also kind of more internal metrics that can be used for product development that you might use even before you go to market. So, let's say you're designing a toddler shoe, something very relevant for me. You would want to look at like the durability of the shoe. How long does it last? Like the stability. Toddlers aren't always great at walking. Like they need a stable, supportive shoe. So doing that kind of in-house testing and evaluation, but I'd have metrics around that. Like, in user testing, how long does it take before the laces give out or, what have you? And it's kind of interesting to note too that those metrics like durability, stability, longevity, those are essential to AI tools as well. So always want to have those in mind when we're developing.
Okay. Are there any considerations or challenges that are different when you're dealing with like data science driven or AI driven product features that you need to consider differently than you might in traditional software development?
It's a good question.
I'm thinking, given the probabilistic nature, maybe
that's true
of a lot of the work we do. Sometimes the investment can be so huge, and the outcome can be it's deterministic, but it's still probabilistic.
Yeah. I think it's the Yogi Berra quote where it's like it's hard to make predictions, especially about the future.
Right.
And so we're doing a lot of that. We're making predictions, or if we're making a recommendation, like what if people don't like the recommendations? There's a little bit more what if to it. And so I think, when we're presenting results or a product to a client, or when even early on, you don't want to do this at the end, but kind of couching our preparation and work and proposals in that type of language of saying like, here are our expected outcomes. Here's what we're predicting. And then using confidence intervals to, express a level of confidence so that, we can say like, there's a little bit of wiggle room here, or there's a lot of wiggle room here. We're just not that confident because there's not a lot of data or something like that. So I think that's a big part of it too. And, because of the world that we're in right now with a lot of focus on AI development, it does feel a little bit of higher stakes from like a publicity standpoint too, which is something I'm less qualified to speak about, but it's something that's there. And I think it's something to keep in mind as well.
Okay. My mind goes to just the fact that it's probabilistic, and especially with all the focus on generative AI, generative AI right now. I think it's really, really critical that we guide our clients and that they have the understanding of just how complex and unpredictable some of these services or tools can be when you actually put them into production.
Yeah.
I wanted to go back and ask you, you were a teacher before you got into data science. Talk about that transition. Like, there's a lot of similarities there, I think, under the surface.
For sure. Yeah. It's funny because what actually got me on this kind of career change was data. I had a homeroom class and they had kind of weekly mini goals around like homework completion and things like that. And if they did, a certain level of completion by the end of the year, they got like a big prize at the end of the year on like their end of year trip. And so to motivate them about halfway through the year, I was like, I wonder what would happen if I just put up like a weekly line graph to show their progress. And they loved it. And it was super basic, just put together like a little Microsoft Excel thing. But they really liked seeing their data, which was a key insight for me. And I was like, everyone likes seeing their data. This is not surprising, but it's something that like so obvious. I couldn't live it and think of it. I hadn't thought of it already. And so I got more curious about like the use of data and, read some books on it. Signal and the Noise was the first one. And then kind of went deeper and deeper. And then started like looking at graduate programs to say like, I have an English degree in undergrad. I'm not quite qualified to jump into data science yet. Where can I learn what I need to learn? And so went into grad school for statistics, and in statistics, I worked with a professor who exposed me to the idea of data science. And I don't know how much this is used anymore. Maybe it still is, and I'm not super into it anymore, or just, I don't know, we can edit this part out. But the larger point is there's that like 3-part Venn diagram of like subject matter expertise and statistics and coding. And that just like fascinated me of, you become knowledgeable about a certain industry, you have the coding skills to actually build the stuff, and you have the stat skills to like understand the math of what you're actually doing. So it's not a black box. And so after my grad program, I did a boot camp to learn how to code, and then started teaching kids how to code. And that's where I met Reed, and he introduced me to more kind of people in like the Austin data science software industry. And it's kind of just
And you're off to the races.
Here we are.
And here you are.
Yeah, it's been a cool transition. But I mean, the number of times in a given week that I find myself referencing something that I learned in teaching is pretty high, which is not surprising.
We've talked about this before in another podcast, but at Kung Fu AI, the diversity in backgrounds is one of my favorite things from all the different team members. We've got people with chemistry and biology and mechanical engineering and computer science, stat, math, et cetera.
Yeah.
All right, I want to wrap up, Alex, and ask you our standard finishing question, which is, if you could have AI automate anything in your daily life, what would you go for?
Oh, wow. There's a lot of good things to choose from. I think I want an AI tool that will help recommend and inform when to feed my son what. So not just maybe previously I might have said clean everything up or do all the preparation, but what I really want is predict the most likely thing that he'll be into for that meal at that time. Just lay that out for me and I'll take care of the rest. That would be gold.
Yeah, feed the young children.
Yep.
I love it. Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks.
I really appreciate it. It was a fantastic conversation.
Absolutely.
Thank you for listening to Hidden Layers. This series is hosted by Kung Fu AI, a management consulting and engineering firm focused exclusively on artificial intelligence. If you have any questions or thoughts about today's episode, or if you know someone we should feature, please visit us at kungfu.ai.